welcome to the fourth episode of Season 10 of the Dark Money Files, in which we shine a light into a murky world. I am Ray Blake, and with me is my co-host, friend and business partner, Graham Barrow. Hello, Graham.
Hello, Ray.
Big news, Graham. Now, we talk a lot about the shady things that shady people can get away with. Well, thanks to a new product called Cure, that's K-U-R-E, by fund administration experts Deep Pool, this is a lot more difficult to do in that space.
Oh, yes.
It's able to pull all relevant data from anywhere in the world to give their clients a single real-time accurate global investor record, and it manages the entire onboarding life cycle, start to finish, saving them huge wastes of time as well as from huge reputational risk. You can find out more at deep-pool.com.
I certainly will be, Ray.
Brilliant. So what's on the menu today, Graham?
Bias and noise, Ray. Bias and noise.
Bias and noise. Now that sounds immediately interesting to me, but that probably says more about me, doesn't it? Is this going to interest our general audience, though?
Well, it's definitely important, Ray. And I suppose the whole point of this podcast and our role inside it is to make it interesting.
Okay, well, that sounds like a challenge to me. I'm happy to rise to that one.
Good.
I suppose we'd better start off by defining those two terms and the difference between them.
I think you're right, Ray. And you know, I've given this an awful lot of thought.
Yeah, that certainly sounds like you. And I think this is a subject that you're probably quite attached to, isn't it?
Oh, Ray, you have no idea how much. and I do think it is really important. Now, one of the challenges, of course, is to find a way of explaining the difference between bias and noise without having the opportunity, to use any visuals.
Yeah, no, I think we've all seen them, and you can Google them online if you're at all interested in that sort of thing. But I mean, this is an audio podcast. We shouldn't have to rely on visuals. What did you come up with?
Well, a thermometer. Well, technically, actually, Ray, two thermometers.
I'm always worried when people say they've got two thermometers because I'm suspicious about where the second one goes.
Yes.
Okay, but in this case, they're both going in the same place, aren't they?
They are, but they're different because one is a noisy thermometer and the other one is a biased thermometer.
Okay, now explain that to me.
Well, all right. So supposing, Ray, that you aren't feeling very well and you want to see if you're running a fever, as you might.
Okay, yep.
You've got two thermometers, but neither of them gives you a consistent reading.
Okay, now I've been there many times for myself and for my children when they were younger, and it can drive you absolutely crazy. The modern digital ones tend to be a lot more accurate, though, don't they?
Well, they do. But you just have to bear with me because for the example, you're just going to have to work with, you've got one noisy and one biased one.
Rightio, and we're talking more 20th century technology now, aren't we? Okay,
I think so, yeah. But
well, I'll bear with you. Yeah,
well,
I can do that for you, Graham.
All right, well, thank you, Ray. Now, supposing that your precise temperature is 38.9 degrees centigrade. Okay, that's what it is.
Okay.
You take 5 readings from the first thermometer, and they're 39.1, 39.3, 38.9, 39, and 39.3.
Okay, so they're all quite close, but only one of those is correct. And they're sort of above where my temperature is for the most part, and the average reading is 39.12. That's a little bit higher than my real temperature.
It is. So let's try the second thermometer, and this gives you the following 5 readings. They're 38.4, 39.2, 38.6, 39.4, and 38.9. Okay,
so they vary much more widely. So immediately, I think they're less accurate. But some of them are higher, some of them are lower, and bizarrely enough, the average is 38.9, which is my exact temperature.
It is. So does that make the readings more reliable, or is it just a happy coincidence?
Well, given the significantly greater variance, I'm going to suggest coincidence.
I think you're probably right, which means applying the same logic, assuming you didn't know your temperature in advance, which would render the whole process redundant anyway.
True.
Would it be safe to assume you would tend to have greater belief in the first set of readings because they were more closely aligned?
Yeah, they're clustered much more narrowly, aren't they? And intuitively, I feel that they must be more accurate. But as we know, that would have given me a misleading view of what my temperature really is.
And that's the point, Ray. If you don't know what the target looks like, it's very difficult to detect bias in the results.
So that sounds like the right moment to bring this into our world and to provide our listeners with a proper definition of the difference then.
Well, I think you should.
Well, I'll have a go. Thanks for that.
Right. That's all right.
So bias is the average error in measurements or judgments, the average error, whereas noise is the variability in those measurements or judgments.
Okay, so taking our example, the first set of measurements had an average error of 0.22 degrees, and all the variance was in the same direction, whereas the second set had high variability in all directions.
So I think I'm starting to see why you wanted to talk about this, especially following our last episode on management information. Does your MI contain either noise or bias?
Well, I think it certainly or probably contains both, but it's really important to have a view on that and try and account for any, especially if it's in very vital legal or compliance areas.
Yeah, fair point. There are times when noise might be useful, but not when there's a clear right or wrong answer.
Exactly. If you've been feeling unwell and your doctor sends you for tests, for example, you want the outcome of those tests to be as accurate and as easy to understand as possible.
Now, Graham, there you raise an interesting point.
Do I?
Yeah, you sound surprised.
Well,
yeah, it's the notion that accuracy and understandability are separate issues.
Okay, so go on.
Well, I mean, we had a similar conversation in our last episode on MI. Compiling accurate data is only half the job. Interpreting that data in a consistent way inside different people's heads is supplemental to that compilation and presentation of data, and it also needs to be done well and done consistently.
Exactly, which brings into sharp focus the issues with noise and bias. It can happen twice, once in the collection and again in the interpretation.
I think we're going to need to walk through an example.
I think that's a good idea. Have you got one in mind?
Well, I'm thinking of client risk assessments here.
So no big deal then.
No, not that important, obviously. Now, most firms are going to use a variety of factors, aren't they, when assessing specific client risks? They don't just pin it on one risk factor, generally. They'll look at a range of delivery channel and geographic exposures and employment or industry exposure, products, political influence. All of those things will go in the mix.
Yes, and each of those are usually both scored and weighted.
So it's easy to see how bias can creep into this process simply by the firm or those responsible for the client risk assessment having a preconceived idea of where the risks are greater and weighting them accordingly.
Yeah, of course they could be right.
Well, they could be, yeah, but it doesn't necessarily follow.
No, I agree. So, okay, bias. And how could noise become a problem then?
Well, again, it would depend on the individual firm and their overall approach, but lots of people use multiple channels. They may be from a specific country, resident in a different country, generating income from a third country. So they may have multiple locations as well and multiple products, and it may not be quite as binary as living in one place using one product in one way.
Okay, so different people might take a different view on how to score each of these, and you end up with kind of unpredictable variability.
Exactly. And it's not just different people.
Okay, you need to explain that.
Okay, yeah, no, fair point. So look, you can have different flavours of both noise and bias, Graham. One might be group bias versus personal bias, but you can also generate both group and personal noise.
Okay, well, I get the first one. I mean, for example, you might have one particular member of a risk committee who always sees the worst or the best in clients and acts accordingly.
Yeah, but if that's not reflected in the committee as a whole, then it's fair enough and it can be managed, right?
Yeah, but if the majority of the committee members are, say, overly optimistic about the nature of some of their high risk clients.
Oh, I recognise that.
Mm,
It can expose the firm to greater risks than their risk appetite dictates, or that their control framework is constructed to manage.
okay, I see that. But what about this idea you can have personal noise?
Well, I think that's where it gets really interesting. A great deal of research has been done on the consistency with which sentences are handed down to convicted criminals.
And you'd hope, wouldn't you, that for the same crime you get the same sentence within at least a reasonable degree of variance.
Yeah, exactly. But that's just not the case, Graham. Not only is there very clear evidence of both bias and noise within groups of judges, different judges handing down different sentences based on different biases and prejudices, but individual judges within the group are also not consistent with the sentences that they themselves hand down.
Okay, hence the effort that some lawyers go to in trying to ensure they get the right judge for their client.
Exactly. There used to be a specific category of judges known as hanging judges when such a thing was still part of the law here in the UK because they were known to apply the death sentence far more frequently than their peers.
Which is clearly biased.
Hmm.
But how do you explain noise?
Through all sorts of external factors, Graham. The day of the week, whether you've had a good lunch or not, how sleepy you are, whether your football team won at the weekend.
Really?
Yeah, there's a great deal of empirical evidence to back up this analysis. It really has an effect.
So you're actually saying that the length of sentence some unfortunate criminal, if I can use that expression,
hmm
receives could
hmm
depend on whether some football team won last weekend.
That's exactly what I'm saying. It's been proven to be a factor again and again.
Which means noise and bias have incredibly relevant real world effects.
Yes, they do.
All right, so let's go back to our client risk assessment. I can see straight away that a team with varying levels of competence and maybe inadequate training could produce highly inconsistent results.
Yeah, but then individuals who are pretty competent and have had decent training can also produce inconsistent results depending on whether they've had a great weekend or they're in a good mood or it's a Friday afternoon or if they've had a rotten week and they just can't wait to get home.
So that's the issue. Production of data can lead to both bias and noise, which can then in
hmm
turn be followed by the same set of potential outcomes in the interpretation of the data.
And it makes you wonder how we ever managed to get things right at all.
Yeah, I think it's important to stress that in many cases the effect, whilst measurable, may be small and containable.
Yeah, now the problem starts if you have significant corporate bias or a poorly trained workforce who generate significant noise because, rigour and process and checks and balances will control for an awful lot of this.
I absolutely agree.
Mm.
While we're at it, though, Ray, we ought to talk about false positives and false negatives, I think, shouldn't we?
Yeah, it's a subject that comes up a lot and it's quite close to your heart, isn't it?
Well, it is, Ray, partly because it can be really difficult to understand.
So do you want to share an example of why it's so hard?
I would love to, and it's provided by a gentleman called Gerd Gigerenzer, the author of Reckoning with Risk, one of the best books I have ever read on the subject.
Yeah, I agree. I think it was through you that I was led to that book, actually. It's pretty good.
Yeah, well, I just think it's wonderful. Gigerenzer believes we are very poor at understanding the way most data are presented to us and gives an example close to my heart at the moment in respect of cancer testing.
And there could hardly be anything more important than ensuring accurate and consistent understanding of cancer test results, right?
Well, that's exactly right, Ray. So he did a study where he gave doctors with an average of 14 years professional experience the following test. Now, you're going to have to listen carefully because I'm going to throw some numbers at you. Quotes, the prevalence of colorectal cancer was 0.3%. The sensitivity of the test was 50%, and the false positive rate was 3%. So the doctors were asked, what is the probability that someone who tests positive actually has colorectal cancer?
Yeah, and this is, I remember reading this in the book, and it's baffling because that's exactly the way that this information is presented to doctors, and so many of them just don't understand it. But look, before we go to the outcome and dig any deeper, we should unpick that sentence a little bit. Prevalence means its occurrence, its rate of occurrence within the general population. Sensitivity is how accurate the result of the test is. And false positive rate is the frequency with which a positive test is wrong.
Exactly. And about half of the doctors either chose 50% or 47% as the likelihood that the person tested actually had cancer.
Yeah, and here's where they got that from. They thought that the test was right 50% of the time and chose that. Or they thought right 50% of the time, but 3% were false positives, so it must be 47%. So which of them was correct?
Well, no one who chose either of those answers was even close to being correct, Ray.
So, come on, how does it work, Graham? What's the model answer here?
Well, Ray, let me reframe that question and see how you get on this time.
Okay.
30 out of every 10,000 people, 0.3%, have colorectal cancer.
Okay.
Of those 30 people, 15 will have a positive result on the cancer test, which is 50% sensitivity. Of those who do not have cancer, 300 will still receive a positive result, which is the false positive rate of 3%.
Right.
What proportion of those who get a positive result, Ray, will actually have colorectal cancer?
Well, it's 15 out of what, 315?
Well, absolutely, which is as near as makes no difference, 5%,
right?
Not 47% or 50%.
That's a heck of a difference, isn't it?
It is if you haven't got colorectal cancer, Ray. Absolutely.
So given that the test is only right half the time that someone does have cancer, the results are inherently noisy, aren't they?
Yes, and there is a 3% bias to false positives.
And there are also false negatives, aren't there?
Yes. Inherently in the not the specificity, the sensitivity of the test.
So of the 30 people who were tested, the test said half of them actually have it and was correct, and half of them don't have it, and those were false negatives.
Absolutely. Yes.
Wow.
Yes. So the test will produce both a false negative rate and a false positive rate. And of course, if one is higher than the other, then overall it's biased towards whatever that falsity is.
That makes sense. That makes absolute sense. And it's a lot clearer than the way it was originally worded, isn't it?
Well, the way it was originally worded made no sense to me whatsoever, Ray. So, yeah, definitely.
Nor to experienced doctors, it transpires.
Clearly.
So if we connect this episode on noise, bias and interpretation with our last episode on management information, you kind of realise that understanding the risks that your firm faces is not just a question of putting some figures on a balanced scorecard or a management dashboard and hoping for the best.
No, definitely not.
Well, I think do you know what? This has got a bit esoteric at times,
Mm.
and we may well have fried a few people's brains. Certainly enough for one day. Shall we think about what we're going to do next?
Well, we should. I mean, I've got to say, Ray, I actually had a huge amount of fun researching and recording this, but I hope
me too.
some of that comes through to our audience. So
that's who we are, though, isn't it?
it absolutely is, which is odd because our next episode is about dinosaurs, right?
Now, I know so many dinosaurs, Graham, but we're going to take an interesting angle on things Cretaceous and especially Jurassic. And I, for one, am looking forward to it.